Looking back, I cannot pinpoint the exact moment things began to feel off, but if I had to choose, it would be those late nights. The ones where I would roll over, half asleep, expecting to see Emma lying beside me like she always did. Instead, more often than not, she was turned away, her face illuminated by the pale light of her phone. It might sound silly, but there was a time I would have done anything just to see her smile, to see her truly happy. Lately, though, it was as if I was staring at a stranger who only resembled my wife. Her grin was not the warm, familiar one I had known for years. It was sharper, more private, like she was sharing some secret joke I was not a part of. I did not want to be the husband who saw ghosts where there were none. The husband who made a big deal out of nothing. But night after night, there she was, completely absorbed in her own world. Her fingers would dart over the screen, her attention fully claimed. I would turn away, pretending to sleep, but the feeling of her slipping away grew stronger every single time. Emma used to share everything with me. Sure, we had our ups and downs, like any couple, but there was never a time when she did not open up about her day, even the mundane parts. Suddenly, though, every conversation began to feel rehearsed, guarded. She would throw out vague explanations. "Oh, just the girls again," or "Sorry, it's work." I would nod along, trying not to overanalyze, but when you have been with someone for years, you just know when they are not being honest. It was not always outright lies, more like half-truths or omissions. Each girl's night out added weight to this gnawing pit in my stomach, whispering that something was not right. I remember one night vividly, as if it happened yesterday. I woke up around 2 in the morning and saw her laughing at something on her phone. I did not have to look twice, her smile was radiant, a kind of joy I had not seen in months. I froze, pretending to be asleep, but it felt like my heart was hammering louder than her laughter. Who was making her smile like that? Part of me wanted to grab the phone and demand answers right then and there. But another part, the part that doubted itself, held back. What if I was just being insecure? I had no hard evidence, just a nagging feeling. Still, things between us were shifting in ways I could not ignore. She was always too tired or not in the mood. I understood life could be exhausting, but this was different. She seemed to actively avoid closeness with me. Whenever I tried to address it, she would wave it off, as if I was imagining things. But I knew I was not. The woman I had loved for years was right there, yet it felt like she was miles away. The signs kept piling up. One afternoon, Emma was chatting about some inside joke with her work friends. I nodded along, playing the supportive husband. But when I asked for details, her expression tightened, and she brushed me off. It was clear, she did not want me to be part of the joke. Another time, I caught her laughing at a message on her phone. When I asked her what was funny, she just smiled, shrugged, and changed the subject. That was the moment it hit me. I was not just being left out, I was being shut out. Even my friends started noticing. Jake, one of my closest buddies from work, casually mentioned seeing Emma around town with a guy he thought looked familiar. Jake was not one to pry, he would probably laugh off catching someone in the act. But his comment rattled me. Now, every girls' night or late meeting made my imagination run wild. Who was she really with? And then, as if the universe wanted to torment me, things got worse. The breaking point came with Nathan, one of our mutual friends. He always seemed a bit too attentive to Emma. At gatherings, he was the first to offer her a drink, quick with jokes, and always seemed to hang on her every word. It was subtle at first, but once I noticed it, I could not unsee it. One weekend, we were all out with friends, and I caught Nathan watching Emma with a little too much interest. He would linger near her, laugh a bit too hard at her jokes, and hang on to every word she said. Once I noticed it, every shared glance or laugh between them felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I was not ready to admit it yet, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. After that whole episode with Dylan being overly attentive, I began wondering if I was the only one noticing his behavior. Surely someone else had seen the way he hovered around Emma like a lovesick puppy. That was when it hit me, Charlotte, his wife. She was always nearby, and I could not help but wonder if she had picked up on the same things I had. For a while, I kept the thought to myself. Bringing it up to her felt risky. What if she had not noticed anything? What if I ended up looking like some paranoid idiot? But the sense that something was festering just beneath the surface refused to leave me alone. Eventually, I decided to take a chance. One afternoon, I sent her a casual text, "Hey, have you noticed Dylan and Emma seem pretty close lately?" I kept it light, just in case I was overreacting. Charlotte's response came almost instantly, "Funny you say that. I was just thinking the same thing." My heart pounded as I read her words. What started as casual texts about their behavior quickly turned into something deeper. Each message felt like peeling back another layer of this tangled mess we were both caught in. It was oddly comforting to know I was not alone in this. Charlotte was just as frustrated and in the dark as I was. We began texting regularly after that. It was strange, this silent understanding between us. We were both stuck in marriages that felt like they were unraveling, and neither of us knew the full extent of what was happening. Our conversations became a kind of secret lifeline. Charlotte would tell me about Dylan's sudden late nights and last-minute business dinners, while I filled her in on Emma's endless excuses about girls' nights that always seemed to coincide. Each little detail we shared felt like another piece of a puzzle neither of us wanted to solve, but at this point, we had no choice. Then came the night everything fell apart. Around 8 in the evening, Charlotte texted me to say Dylan had just left for one of his so-called work meetings. The timing lined up too perfectly. Emma had told me she would be working late at the office. My stomach twisted into a knot. This was our chance to finally get answers. Charlotte and I agreed to meet and follow them. The whole plan felt absurd, like something out of a bad crime show. But we needed to know. We parked near Emma's office and waited. Not even 10 minutes passed before we saw her walk out, glancing nervously around. Moments later, Dylan's car pulled up, and she climbed in. Watching her slip into his car felt like a punch to the gut. We followed them in silence as they drove across town, eventually stopping at a hotel. They walked inside together, laughing. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, and judging by the look on Charlotte's face, neither could she. We stayed in the car, stunned. Charlotte broke down, her shoulders trembling as she sobbed. I sat there, trying to process it all, the anger inside me building to a boiling point. I wanted to punch something, scream, do anything to release the rage clawing at me. But instead, I focused on comforting Charlotte, even though I could barely deal with my own pain. It felt surreal, two betrayed spouses, sitting together in shared misery. We both knew we needed proof. Something undeniable. I snapped photos of Emma and Dylan as they left the hotel together. As I held my phone, framing the shots, I felt like I was betraying the very life I had spent years building. This was my wife, my life, and here I was, documenting its collapse. Charlotte looked over at me as I took the photos, her expression a mix of anguish and determination. We both knew these pictures would be our shield when the time for confrontation came. That night, I barely slept. I replayed every moment in my head, Emma's nervous glances, Dylan's smirk, Charlotte's tear-streaked face. Everything felt wrong, like I was trapped in a nightmare. Emma came home hours later, creeping through the door. I pretended to be asleep. I was not ready to face her. Not yet. The next morning, as we had coffee, I asked casually, "So, how was work last night?" I poured my coffee slowly, keeping my voice steady. She barely looked at me and muttered something about it being the usual. Her eyes flickered, though, and I knew she was lying. When I pressed her gently, her irritation flared. "Why are you being so nosy?" she snapped, looking at me like I was some stranger intruding on her life. I swallowed the urge to throw the pictures in her face. I was not ready to tip my hand yet. Instead, I nodded, pretending to let it go. After that night at the hotel, Charlotte and I could not stop texting. We vented to each other, shared every little betrayal we had noticed over the months, piecing together just how deep this affair went. But we both agreed, confronting them outright was not enough. Not after everything we had seen. We wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, the same anxiety we had been living with. We met in person a few days later, at a quiet park on the edge of town. Sitting on a bench overlooking the pond, we planned our next steps. Should we call them out in front of everyone at a family gathering? Or leave small hints until they unraveled on their own? Every idea sounded ridiculous, but we laughed anyway, caught in the absurdity of it all. Somewhere in that mix of anger and betrayal, I felt a strange pull toward Charlotte. Sitting beside her, hearing her laugh, I realized I had not felt warmth like that in a long time. It was not planned, but before I knew it, we were leaning in, our lips meeting in a desperate kiss. It was raw, messy, and full of all the pain we had bottled up. We did not talk about it afterward. There was no need. From that moment on, we were in this together. And nothing was going to stop us. Emma and I arrived together, presenting the image of a happy couple. It was as fake as it felt. Across the table, I spotted Charlotte. Her expression was calm, too calm, like she was holding something back. At one point during the evening, she casually mentioned to the group, "You know, I have always had this knack for knowing when someone is keeping a secret." She let the words linger, looking around the table with a sly smile. I watched as Dylan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, stealing a glance at Emma, who suddenly looked like she had bitten into a lemon. Their discomfort was undeniable, and I could not help but savor it. The subtle tension between them did not go unnoticed. A few friends exchanged curious glances, sensing something was off. No one said anything outright, but I could tell they were starting to wonder. That tension was exactly what we had hoped for, a small dose of paranoia to keep them on edge. Charlotte pushed it further by organizing a casual gathering with some of our mutual friends. The plan was straightforward: plant just enough seeds of doubt to make Dylan and Emma squirm, without exposing them outright. Throughout the evening, Charlotte made her moves. She would drop seemingly harmless comments, the kind that would only make sense to someone who knew the truth. "It is funny," she said at one point, "how some people think their secrets will never come out. Life has a way of revealing things." Each time, I watched Emma's smile falter, and Dylan suddenly need to refill his drink or glance away. It was not long before some friends started picking up on the strange vibe. A couple of them even asked me if everything was okay between Emma and me. I kept it simple, shrugging as I replied, "Just a rough patch, you know." It was vague enough to make them curious but direct enough to draw their attention. The beauty of our plan was that the longer we kept this going, the more obvious their cracks would become to everyone else. The real test came during a double date Charlotte and I arranged with Dylan and Emma. It was a bold move, one that could easily backfire, but we wanted them to feel the walls closing in. We met at a cozy little restaurant, the kind of place where couples go for an intimate dinner. From the start, the air was thick with tension. Charlotte and I played our roles perfectly. We were casual and friendly but peppered the conversation with just enough pointed glances and subtle hints to unsettle them. At one point, Charlotte leaned toward Dylan, her voice just loud enough for all of us to hear, and said, "You know, it is strange how the truth has a way of coming out, even when you least expect it." Dylan froze, his face draining of color as he exchanged a nervous glance with Emma. She looked down at her plate, her hands fidgeting, her discomfort almost palpable. The rest of the night was a carefully orchestrated game of psychological warfare. Every calculated comment, every exchanged glance, was designed to make them feel the noose tightening around them. I watched Emma closely, her nervous glances at Dylan, the way her fingers twisted her napkin into knots. It took everything in me not to laugh. They were unraveling right in front of us, and it was exactly what they deserved. By the time we left the restaurant, they looked like they had just come out of a war zone. I could not help but feel a dark sense of satisfaction. The party was the perfect backdrop for the next phase of our plan. It was a big event with a mix of friends and family, the kind of gathering where whispers could spread like wildfire. Charlotte and I arrived separately, keeping our distance at first to avoid suspicion. But we had a strategy, and tonight we were done playing subtle. Charlotte struck first. I watched from across the room as she joined a conversation with Emma and a few friends. Her face was calm, her tone casual, but I knew what she was doing. "Oh, I heard the craziest story recently," she began, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of others nearby. "A friend of mine found out her husband was cheating. She had no idea for years until she stumbled upon the evidence." Emma's reaction was priceless. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, and her hands fidgeted as she forced a strained smile. Charlotte went on, weaving a story filled with just enough detail to hit close to home. As she described how her friend had uncovered everything, Emma's face grew paler. She glanced over at Dylan, who was standing across the room, and I could tell she was wondering if this was all a coincidence, or if Charlotte knew. But that was just the opening act. Later, I made my move. Emma approached me with a question, and as we talked, I casually unlocked my phone, scrolling as if looking for something. In plain view was a photo of her and Dylan leaving the hotel together. I flipped past it quickly, pretending not to notice her reaction, but her face froze, her eyes locked on the screen. I acted as if nothing had happened, slipping my phone back into my pocket and continuing the conversation as if everything was normal. The rest of the party felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. Emma and Dylan were visibly shaken, their paranoia growing by the minute. It was working, and this was just the beginning. I could see Emma leaning in close to Dylan, her face tight as she whispered urgently, trying to keep her voice low. Across the room, Charlotte and I exchanged glances, sharing small, knowing smiles that spoke volumes without saying a word. Those silent looks were all it took to stoke their paranoia. Friends started to pick up on the tension, too. A couple of them approached me, concerned, asking if everything was okay between Emma and me. I shrugged casually and hinted that we were going through a tough patch. It was not a lie, but it was vague enough to let the rumor mill do its work. Each glance and every small interaction between Charlotte and me added to the growing fire, fueling the questions swirling in the room. Whispers began spreading, whispers that Emma and Dylan could not ignore. Charlotte was relentless. At one point, I noticed her alone with Dylan in the kitchen. I could not catch every word, but I saw her leaning in, her voice calm but firm, saying something that drained all the color from his face. "I know more than you think," I heard her say. Dylan's eyes darted around, panic etched across his face as if he were afraid someone else might overhear. From that moment on, he was glued to Emma's side. They huddled in hushed conversations, stealing nervous glances around the room like fugitives waiting for the hammer to fall. It was almost entertaining to watch them unravel. Every time Charlotte and I exchanged a glance or smiled, they became more frazzled, their nerves fraying further as the evening wore on. As the party wound down, Charlotte and I decided to turn up the heat. We both noticed how Emma and Dylan's eyes followed us everywhere, trying to decode our every move. So I leaned in a little closer to Charlotte, laughing at something she said while casually resting my hand on her shoulder. She played along seamlessly, tilting her head toward me and letting her hand brush my arm. It was the perfect touch to push them further into paranoia. I saw Emma's face twist, caught between shock and fury. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away, but the damage was done. Dylan did not fare any better. He looked ready to confront us but stopped himself every time, hesitating, his confidence crumbling. They were too unsure of what we knew and too afraid to make a scene. When we finally left the party, Charlotte shot me a smirk. It was the look of someone who knew we had accomplished exactly what we set out to do. Emma and Dylan were left to stew in their own paranoia and confusion, unraveling under the weight of their betrayal. The family gathering was the culmination of everything we had been building toward, a grand finale to months of frustration, anger, and meticulous planning. Emma and I arrived separately, as did Charlotte and Dylan, each of us blending into the crowd. But we knew the night would end with the truth laid bare. As the evening progressed, my pulse quickened. The room was packed, relatives, close friends, people who had known Emma and me for years. It felt surreal standing among them, knowing the bombshell I was about to drop would shatter everything. When the moment felt right, I cleared my throat and spoke loudly enough to silence the room. "Excuse me, everyone," I began, my voice steady. The hum of chatter stopped, and dozens of eyes turned to me. From across the room, I saw Emma freeze, confusion flickering into dread. Dylan, standing next to her, went rigid, his forced smile faltering. "I know this is not what you expected tonight," I continued, keeping my tone calm. "But there is something I need to say." The tension was palpable. I saw Emma's hand reach for Dylan's, her grip tightening as they braced for what was coming. "For the past several months," I said, letting the silence hang for a moment, "Emma and Dylan have been having an affair." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by stunned silence. Slowly, I pulled out my phone, my hand steady, and displayed the photos, clear evidence of Emma and Dylan leaving the hotel together. I flipped through the pictures deliberately, ensuring everyone in the room saw the truth. Emma stumbled backward, her face pale, while Dylan opened his mouth as if to speak but could not find the words. Charlotte stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "I just want everyone to know how much this has hurt," she began, tears glistening in her eyes. "Dylan was my husband, my partner, and he destroyed everything we built together." She held up her phone, showing text messages that were just as damning. Every detail, every piece of evidence painted a picture of betrayal so undeniable that no one in the room could look away. The reactions were swift. Relatives exchanged horrified glances, and friends shook their heads in disgust. Some openly voiced their anger. "How could you do this to Jack?" To Charlotte, someone demanded. Another friend muttered, "I cannot believe I trusted you both." Emma's face went through a whirlwind of emotions, shock, anger, disbelief, and finally desperation. She approached me, her eyes wide and pleading. "Jack, please," she whispered, clutching my arm. "We can fix this. You have to believe me." It didn't mean anything. Her words were hollow, and I let them hang in the air before meeting her gaze. "It is over, Emma. I am done." My voice was calm, resolute. She broke down, her face crumpling, but I felt nothing but cold finality. Across the room, Dylan was attempting his own damage control, approaching friends with weak explanations. But no one listened. They turned their backs, their faces hard and unforgiving. His desperation was pitiful, but I could not bring myself to care. He was living the consequences of his actions. By the end of the night, Emma and Dylan stood isolated, shunned by nearly everyone. Charlotte and I left together, stepping into the cool night air, leaving them behind to face the wreckage they had created. The truth was out, and we had finally reclaimed control. In the weeks that followed, everything in my life became crystal clear. It felt like a veil had finally been lifted, exposing the raw truth I had avoided for far too long. Charlotte and I, battered and scarred from the wreckage of our failed marriages, had somehow found a glimmer of something real in each other. It was a twist of fate neither of us could have anticipated, almost poetic in its irony. The two people left behind had discovered each other, not through love, but through shared pain. One quiet evening, we sat on my porch, the warm summer air settling around us as the sun dipped low on the horizon. It had been a calm day, a rare moment of peace that had once felt impossible. As we talked about everything and nothing, the conversation shifted into something deeper. We began to speak about the future, not just a year or two from now, but the dreams we had once buried, the hopes we had forgotten while entangled in broken relationships. "We've both been given a second chance," Charlotte said softly, her eyes fixed on the fading sunset. "I don't want to waste it. I want something real this time." Her words struck a chord deep within me. The vulnerability in her voice was something I hadn't realized I craved, and in that moment, I knew I wanted the same. We stayed there for hours, late into the night, sharing what truly mattered to us now. Trust sat at the heart of it all. We had both seen how secrets could rot even the strongest bonds. By the end of the night, we made a promise: no matter what, we would stay honest, even if the truth was difficult to hear. Meanwhile, Emma was not ready to let go. She showed up at my doorstep more than once, her face pale and drawn, as if she had not slept in days. The first time, I opened the door to see her standing there, fresh tears streaking her face. "Jack, please," she began, her voice trembling. "Can we talk? I made a mistake, and I know I did, but we can fix this." Her desperation was evident, but all I felt was a strange, hollow numbness. The words pouring out of her mouth, the apologies, the pleas, they felt rehearsed, hollow. She rambled on about regret and how we could find our way back, but when she paused to hear my response, all I could manage was a quiet, firm, "Emma, it's over. There is nothing left to fix." Her face crumpled at my words, and for a moment, pity flickered in my chest. But it passed as quickly as it came. The betrayal was too deep, the damage irreparable. After that, her messages came in waves, swinging between apologies and bitterness. At first, she promised to change, to do better, but when I ignored her, the tone shifted. She blamed me, accusing me of driving her into Dylan's arms. It was exhausting, and finally, I blocked her number. I needed to close that chapter of my life for good. In the midst of all this, our mutual friends rallied around Charlotte and me. They were just as blindsided as we had been. Many reached out with support and condolences. Some even admitted to having noticed small things, subtle signs they had chosen to ignore. Over coffee one afternoon, a friend named Brian confessed he had seen Dylan behaving too familiarly with Emma at parties. He had brushed it off at the time but now felt guilty for not speaking up. Slowly, openly, Charlotte and I began dating. It felt different, like starting over with a clean slate. There was no pretense, no hidden agendas. Just two people who had been through hell, ready for something honest. The first time I held her hand in public, it felt strange but right, like a connection I had not felt in years. We spent hours walking together, sometimes deep in conversation, sometimes in comfortable silence. With each step, the weight of the past began to lift. One evening, after a long day, we curled up on my couch. Her head rested on my shoulder, and her fingers traced lazy circles on the back of my hand. The quiet between us was soothing, and I found myself savoring the stillness. Charlotte looked up at me, her expression warm but serious. "No more secrets, right?" she asked softly, her gaze searching mine. "None," I promised, my voice steady. "I'm all in." We both knew too well what secrets could do, the destruction they left in their wake. I had no intention of ever going down that road again, and I could see the same determination in her eyes. As we walked hand in hand down the street one cool evening, the streetlights casting a soft glow, it struck me how far we had come. We had both been broken by the people we thought we would spend forever with, but here we were, stronger, rebuilding from the ashes. We stopped at the end of the street, and I turned to her, feeling something I had not felt in years: hope. "Here's to new beginnings," I said, my voice filled with conviction. She smiled, squeezing my hand. To trust, honesty, and finally letting go of the past. Together, we stepped forward, leaving behind the weight of betrayal and heartbreak. What we had was not a rebound or a temporary escape. It was something real, built on respect, shared pain, and a promise to never repeat the mistakes of the past. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was genuinely excited for what the future held.